The cold morning air hung like a sheet of glass over the Arden forest, sharp enough to sting the lungs, still enough to make every sound echo. It was January 1945, and the snow packed under the boots of men who had been fighting too long, sleeping too little, and surviving on discipline more than strength. In the dim gray light before sunrise, the shattered outlines of American tanks sat half-buried under frost and silence. Among them were the men of the 761st Tank Battalion Black Soldiers, who had fought their way across France with a ferocity that defied every expectation of the segregated army they served. Their engines were quiet now, their ammunition gone, their food long finished. Somewhere beyond the thin line of trees, German voices drifted through the cold. The war had closed in. Sergeant Willie Mays, broad-shouldered, mud-streaked and exhausted, pressed his gloved hand against the frozen hatch of his Sherman. He could hear distant boots crunching snow, the bark of orders in German, the clatter of rifles being slung forward. The sounds moved closer, crawling into the silence like a storm building in slow motion. Beside him, Private Ernest Hopkins lifted his hands slightly, fingers trembling in the cold, not in fear. They both knew what was coming. Their tank was out of fuel, cut off during the night. Their battalion had been pushing against German counterattacks for weeks without rest. Now the line had been pierced, and their small group was surrounded. The first German soldiers appeared through the tree-line, rifles drawn, nerves high, expressions hard. The Americans raised their hands. No one spoke. Snow fell lightly, catching on steel helmets, softening a moment that could have turned violent with one misunderstanding. A German non-commissioned officer stepped forward, scanning the faces of the captured tankers, his gaze lingering on their skin. The brief pause was unmistakable. Nazi racial ideology had conditioned many of these men to see black soldiers as subhuman. And yet here they stood, combat veterans who had helped crush German armored divisions from Normandy to the ARD in NES. The Germans ordered them to move. The column of prisoners marched through the forest, boots slamming into snow, breath billowing from mouths like smoke. The 761st tankers walked with backs straight, refusing to look broken, even as hunger gnawed at them. Some of the younger German guards whispered to each other, surprised at the Americans' calm. They had expected fear. They found defiance. And defiance is what carried these men into captivity. Hours later, the captured soldiers arrived at a makeshift German staging point, an old barn converted into a temporary holding area. The smell of wet straw and diesel fuel drifted in the air. Inside, dozens of post-white Americans from infantry units sat quietly against the wooden walls. When the black tankers entered, some of the white prisoners looked up with a mix of relief and disbelief. They knew the Germans' racial policies. They understood the danger these men now faced. A German lieutenant strode into the barn, thin-faced, sharp-voiced, the type of officer molded by ideology and certainty. He raised a clipboard, calling out instructions for work details. When he reached the names of the black prisoners, he paused. His eyes narrowed with disdain. Then he pointed toward the far side of the barn. "You niggers separate, labor prisoners." The barn fell silent. Sergeant Mays stood motionless, jaw tight. He understood the meaning behind the order. Under German doctrine, black posts were to be treated as colonial laborers denied Geneva protections, used for the hardest manual work and often mistreated or starved. But Mays also knew something the lieutenant did not. Every man in the 761st had been briefed before deployment. They had been told that, if captured, they must insist calmly, firmly on being treated as American soldiers under the Geneva Convention. Mays stepped forward, voice steady. "We are combat soldiers of the United States Army. We stay with our unit," the German lieutenant snapped back sharply. "You do as ordered." The barn's atmosphere tightened. Every American inside seemed to hold their breath. The black tankers exchanged brief glances, silent agreement passing between them. They stood their ground, refusing to move. The German officer's face reddened. His hand twitched toward the holster at his side. For a long moment, violence hovered in the air like electricity, waiting for a spark. But the Germans had a problem. The front line was collapsing. They needed prisoners alive for possible exchanges. And these black posts, disciplined, coordinated, were not behaving like the enemy propaganda had taught them to expect. Finally, the officer spat a curse, slashed his hand through the air, and stormed out. The black tankers remained where they were, shoulders squared, unbroken. Night fell, and the posts were marched again, this time toward a rail station where cattle cars waited. The journey was brutal, cold wind, knifing through thin uniforms, guards shouting, men stumbling. But the tankers walked in formation, refusing to be singled out or isolated. The Germans noticed. Their unity made it harder to enforce segregation. When the prisoners were finally packed into the train cars, the black and white Americans remained together, crammed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness. During the long ride deeper into Germany, one guard attempted to force several of the black posts to kneel for inspection. Mays and Hopkins refused, slowly rising to full height despite guns pointed at them. White prisoners joined them, forming a wall. The guard, overwhelmed, backed off. Every act of resistance, silent, deliberate, spread through the German ranks, creating confusion. These captured soldiers were not behaving like inferiors. They displayed discipline, pride, and unity. And in war, even the enemy can recognize strength. When the train finally stopped at Stalag 3D near Nuremberg, the German commandant took notice of the organized way the tankers exited. He questioned them directly, expecting fear. Instead, the men responded with military precision, giving names, ranks, and serial numbers with an assertiveness that challenged every racial assumption the Germans held. And so, in that bitter winter halfway across the world from home, a group of black American soldiers forced their captors to reevaluate them not with violence or rebellion, but with dignity that could not be broken. Their refusal to bow became the first step in reshaping how they would be treated inside the camp. The barbed wire fences of Stalag 3D glistened under the weak German winter sun, their frost-coated edges shimmering like tiny blades. Beyond them, the camp stretched out in rows of low wooden barracks, each one leaning slightly under the weight of snow that never seemed to melt. The air carried the sharp scent of burning coal mixed with damp wood and unwashed uniforms. For many posts, the camp was a place where morale went to die. But for the black tankers of the 761st, stepping through those gates was the beginning of a new battle, one fought without rifles, tanks, or engines. A battle of endurance, dignity, and sheer refusal to be erased. The German guards watched them closely as they marched inside. Some whispered among themselves. Others stared openly, their expressions revealing a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Nazi propaganda had painted black soldiers as primitive, undisciplined beings. Yet here they were organized, calm, defiant. Their refusal to be segregated during transport had already spread through camp rumor, reaching the officers before the prisoners even arrived. That reputation hung over them now like a shield dot as the camp commandant approached. A tall, thin colonel with a rigid jaw, Sergeant Willie Mays, stepped forward with the same steady bearing he had used on the battlefield. The colonel studied the group carefully, his eyes flicking from face to face, lingering only long enough to register that these men were not the broken captives he expected. He asked, in clipped English for their unit designation. Mays answered in a clear voice, "United States Army, 761st Tank Battalion." The colonel paused. He knew the name. The battalion had fought fiercely in the Ardennes, delaying German advances, knocking out armor and infantry in battles that were becoming legendary even behind enemy lines. The Nazis respected strength, even when it came from those they considered racially inferior. The colonel ordered the registration to begin. Inside the processing hut, the room was cold enough that the ink in the pens ran sluggishly. German clerks sat behind long wooden tables, stamping documents, recording serial numbers, and assigning barrack placements. When one clerk gestured for the black tankers to step into a separate line-marked Arbeitskommandos, the labor detachment's Mays placed his hands on the table and spoke with controlled firmness. "We stay with our unit. We are combat posts." The clerk blinked, startled. In most camps, black posts from colonial units were separated without resistance. But this man was calm, direct, and unwavering. He repeated his serial number, refusing to move. The other tankers stood behind him, silent pillars. The clerk looked toward the lieutenant supervising the process. The lieutenant, sensing potential trouble, hesitated. With the front collapsing and manpower stretched thin, the Germans did not want disruptions, especially not from prisoners who appeared more disciplined than some of their own troops. After a tense moment, the lieutenant waved them into the main line, muttering under his breath but conceding this was the second small victory. But its importance was immense. Inside the barracks, the 761st men settled into life among other post-British airmen, white American infantrymen, French resistance fighters, even a handful of Russians. The barracks were overcrowded, dimly lit, and bitterly cold. Wooden bunks lined the walls in three-tier stacks, stuffed with straw that smelled of mildew and sweat. The metal stove in the center gave off more smoke than heat. But the tankers formed a tight cluster, sharing what little warmth and space they had. They spoke quietly, mapping out a plan not for escape, but for survival with dignity and tact. In the days that followed, they learned the rhythms of the camp, the morning roll calls where guards shouted numbers into the freezing air, the watery soup ladled out at noon, the occasional Red Cross parcel that felt like a treasure chest, the forced march to distant work details. Through it all, the Germans continued probing for weaknesses, testing, watching, waiting for the tankers to break. One morning, a guard attempted to assign several of the black posts to a work crew composed of Eastern European prisoners' labor details known for brutal conditions. The guard smirked as he gestured toward the far gate, expecting immediate compliance. Instead, the tankers simply stood still. Hopkins stepped forward, upright and unshaken. "We are soldiers. We work under Geneva rules. We do not go to forced labor." The guard's smile faded. He sputtered, waving his rifle for emphasis. But the Americans didn't move. Even the white post nearby fell silent, watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and admiration. After several tense minutes, the guards stomped away and returned with an officer. The officer berated them, threatened punishment, shouted that they were not equal to white soldiers. But the Americans held their ground, repeating their names, ranks, and serial numbers with a steadiness that pushed the officer to the edge of rage. Eventually, again, the Germans backed down. These men were not easily intimidated. Their unity made them difficult to isolate. Their persistence forced the camp staff to choose between escalating violence or grudging respect. In a war increasingly desperate for Germany, unnecessary trouble was something the officers could no longer afford. As winter deepened, the tankers found themselves talking more with other posts. Some of the British airmen were shocked at the skill and discipline of the black soldiers, having been exposed to American segregation during earlier interactions. A few were curious about the battalion's battles in France. Others admired their quiet defiance. The shared hardships of imprisonment began to erode old prejudices, creating new bonds that none of them had anticipated. Still, the Germans kept testing them. Food rations were often reduced for black prisoners. During one roll call, a guard pushed a tanker with his rifle, but shouting insults. The tanker didn't raise a hand, he simply stared back with an unbreakable gaze until the guard stepped away. Days later, another guard attempted to shove Mays out of line, muttering racial slurs. Mays didn't move. His boots remained planted, shoulders squared. The guard shoved harder. Mays stayed immovable, refusing to yield even an inch. The white posts around him straightened their posture as well. The guard, unnerved, retreated into the ranks of his own unit. Word spread across the barracks. The black tankers don't bow. Some of the German guards, especially the younger conscripts, began treating them with caution and eventually surprising respect. They saw these men surviving the same hunger, the same cold, the same despair, yet carrying themselves with more discipline than many soldiers on either side of the barbed wire. But the greatest test came in February 1945, when a senior SS officer arrived to inspect the camp. His presence would force the tankers into the most Dangerous confrontation, yet a test that could cost their lives or change their captivity forever. The arrival of the SS officer sent a chill through Schalak 13D far deeper than the winter air itself. His convoy rumbled through the gates just after dawn, engines growling, boots striking the frozen ground in perfect rhythm. Every guard stood straighter. Every prisoner felt the tension tighten like wire pulled to its breaking point. The tankers of the 761st exchanged quick, knowing glances. The Wehrmacht guards could be reasoned with, sometimes even influenced, but the SS followed ideology, not practicality. And their ideology left no room for respect toward black soldiers. The officer was Obersturmbannführer Karl Reinhardt, a man feared for his role overseeing labor camps in Silesia. Tall, severe, with a face carved from contempt, he walked down the center of the compound with meticulous slowness, observing every detail. When he reached the American POW area, his eyes hardened. He gestured to the camp commandant, who hurried to explain. Reinhardt's gaze settled on the cluster of black tankers, the men who refused separation, who had resisted every attempt at humiliation. Reinhardt demanded they be brought forward. The guards obeyed instantly, motioning for the tankers to assemble. Sergeant Willie Mays stepped to the front. Hopkins and the others flanked him, forming a small line of steady, silent defiance. Snow crunched lightly under their boots as they marched. They stood at attention, not in obedience, but in declaration of who they were. American soldiers, not colonial laborers. Reinhardt approached, hands clasped behind his back. His voice, when it came, was low and venomous. He asked for their names, ranks, and units not out of respect, but to confirm the American Negro Battalion he had heard about. Mays responded with calm professionalism, giving the details, with the same precision he used on the battlefield. Reinhardt's lip curled. He stepped closer, inspecting them as though evaluating livestock. Then he issued an order that fell across the compound like a shadow. These men, he said in German, loud enough for everyone to hear, will be assigned to heavy labor. Separate them from the white prisoners. They will learn their place. The guards hesitated. They had seen what happened each time they tried to isolate the tankers. Resistance without violence, refusal without chaos. But this was the SS, and hesitation was dangerous. The commandant swallowed hard and motioned for the guards to act. A guard stepped forward, gesturing with his rifle for the tankers to move, but Mays did not move. Neither did Hopkins, neither did any of the 761st men. They stood as if frozen into the ground itself. Reinhardt's brows tightened. His voice rose, sharp and cutting, repeating the order. Again, the tankers did not move. Their chins lifted slightly, not in aggression but in affirmation. They were soldiers of the United States. Their dignity was not negotiable, not in the Ardennes, not in captivity. Not now. The SS officer stepped directly in front of Mays. The cold between them seemed to vibrate. Reinhardt raised his gloved hand and slapped Mays hard across the face. The sound cracked like a pistol shot across the yard. White posts gasped, guards stiffened. Everything froze. Mays didn't flinch. He stood exactly as before, shoulders square, eyes steady, body immovable. His refusal to react was not submission, it was challenge. Reinhardt recognized it instantly. The officer's face reddened with fury. He reached for his pistol. For a second, the entire compound held its breath. The white posts shifted as if preparing to intervene. The German guards stiffened, horrified if the SS executed American prisoners. The retaliation from the United States after the war would be catastrophic. Even the commandant stepped forward, pleading in low German. Reinhardt hesitated. The SS prided itself on domination, on breaking the will of those they targeted. Yet here was a group of captured soldiers who refused to break, whose discipline rivaled that of elite troops, who faced him with a dignity stronger than any show of force. Killing them would not establish control. It would reveal his failure, slowly, with trembling fury. Reinhardt lowered his pistol. He issued a new order. Return them to their barracks. They will remain with the American prisoners. It was not respect, it was capitulation. The guards escorted the tankers back across the snow, but their pace was no longer forceful. Some even looked away, unable to meet the eyes of men who had just faced down the SS and prevailed. As the tankers resumed their place among the other POWs, murmurs of awe spread through the compound. British airmen whispered, "Did you see that?" White Americans nodded with newfound admiration. Even prisoners from other nationalities, Poles, Frenchmen, Belgians, felt something shift. The black tankers had not just defended themselves. They had defended the dignity of every prisoner in the camp. In the weeks that followed, the German guards treated them differently. The hostility softened into wary respect. Insults grew rare, orders came in more measured tones. The tankers were never assigned to forced labor again. Several Wehrmacht guards even spoke quietly to them in the evenings during roll call, asking about America, about tanks, about battles they had fought. Respect had not been granted. It had been forced earned through the unwavering strength of men who refused to bow. By March 1945, the thunder of distant artillery trembled through the ground. The Allied advance on Germany was accelerating. One night, guards frantically burned documents while trucks roared out of the camp, carrying officers to safety. Posts watched the chaos with cautious hope. On April 16th, American units belonging to the Third Army reached Nuremberg's outskirts. The guards fled. Hours later, U.S. troops stormed the gates, rifles raised, freeing the prisoners. The moment the liberators entered the compound, the black tankers stood tall. They were gaunt, cold, and worn thin by months of deprivation, but unbroken. Some white prisoners approached them directly, thanking them not for fighting in France, but for resisting in captivity. For showing all of them what courage looked like after liberation, U.S. Army intelligence officers interviewed posts from Stalag 13D. Multiple testimonies from both black and white Americans documented the tankers' resistance, how they had refused segregation, refused forced labor, and even stood firm under the threat of execution from the SS. One officer wrote, "Their conduct under captivity was exemplary. They carried themselves with absolute soldierly bearing, even when survival was uncertain." When the 761st Tank Battalion later received the Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, the bravery of its men in combat was honored. But in quiet corners of history books, the story of those captured tankers also lived on, an example of moral courage, equal to any battlefield achievement. They had fought racism on two fronts, at home in their own army and abroad in the camps of a collapsing Reich, and on both fronts they stood undefeated. The war eventually ended. The POW camps dissolved. The fences rusted away. But the legacy of those men who forced their captors to respect them by refusing to be broken endures.